We are very glad to see everyone here at 9 a.m. At 9 a.m. on the last day. Before we get started any further, we just want to ask people's permission in the room, if it's okay if we record the session. Okay, obviously, it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be posted anywhere, but I think we'll be using it as part of preparing a workshop summary. So for those of you who received an email about the panel, the use of socio-political factors, separate from socioeconomic factors in the SSPs, remains, I think, in our impression, relatively poorly developed. Things like demography, things like GDP seem to have properties that can be modeled, where things like socio-political factors, democracy, armed conflict, while they're things that many of us model quantitatively, have not really entered into the SSPs in a systematic way. So in this session, we are inviting really the beginning of a conversation, one where we are so lucky to have a number of panelists who will speak to a number of perspectives on socio-political factors, how they understand them, and what they think both the promise as well as the critiques are about how to integrate them. We will then have, sort of following these talks, we'll move to a moderated session, ones where we hope to hear both from the panelists as well as from the audience. But we really see this as the beginning of a conversation, and we want to make sure we hear all of your voices. Thank you. I will moderate the first two sessions. We're going to lead off first with Ariel Hernandez, who's going to introduce some of the features that he has observed in the literature. And then we'll follow with Halvard Buhag, who will talk to us just in a general sense about socio-political factors, what we know, and some of our ability to do quantitative modeling. We also ask that people stay on time. Inez is a wonderful timekeeper.
I will show you the cards yellow if there's 1 minute left, and red if the time is over. And I think, right?
My presentation and the inputs that I will be giving you, we have selected some of the questions that are usually asked in the literature, related to modeling, climate modeling, and impact modeling. And then I would be summarizing here the sets of questions that are usually asked. The first set of questions is related to societal interactions in a climate change world. So the primary purpose of SSP is to evaluate the analysis related to climate change, including climate policy and climate impacts. So the questions will be, so what are the key variables that may matter from the socio-political vantage point that are critical to this understanding? How may these variables actually interact with Earth system variables? The second set of questions would be related to the validation of socio-political scenarios. And we know that the validation of scenarios and models involves the assessment of their internal consistency, salience, and the capturing of relevant features. So how do we validate socio-political scenarios at all? So how do we validate scenarios from the social science perspective? And what are the benefits or limitations of calibrating scenarios to historical data for transformative futures? What types of constraints validation might introduce into scenarios and models? And are there socio-political futures that are unattainable? And if there are, then how does this implicate scenarios and models? The third sets of questions are related to politics and policies. Democracy and other features of government and culture can greatly influence policy mixes, acceptability, and the dynamics. And how do models or scenarios account for policy and implementation that also depends on governance structures and existing power dynamics? How can or how should the interactions of policies, for example, policies where climate action is not a stated goal, but we could expect climate benefits, such as social welfare policies, be addressed? And how can modelers decide which linkages are relevant at all? The fourth set of questions are related to equity and justice. We know that SDGs are one way that the international community has tried to operationalize equity and justice and other transformative societal outcomes. Other examples include concepts around just transitions, as well as social policies like decent, livable, or minimum income. So we will be asking the question, so how should modelers decide how and when to capture socio-political factors that are subject to notions of justice and fairness? For example, which thresholds and targets are chosen by whom? The next set of questions is related to local and global scales. So we know that local contextuality is a common challenge for global scenarios and modeling. For example, the local context of income equality can pose huge barriers in applying global visions, such as carbon pricing. Then the question would be, how can models differentiate quantifiers to adequately capture the local context, as well as provide regional to global indicators or metrics? The sixth set of questions will be related to human behavior at different levels. And scenarios and models, they tend to assume rationality of actors. So how can the limitations on the rationality of actors, such as incomplete information, be adequately represented in scenarios and models? Can or should models reflect that what we are learning, and that we do change our behavior? So learning processes, so can we actually reflect that in models as well? But how can or should interactions between policies and people be considered, especially with regards to evaluating policy effectiveness or even unintended outcomes? The last set of questions are related to the enablers for collaboration on socio-political scenarios. Collaboration between research communities is key to the improvement of scientific representation of socio-political factors. Then we will be asking, so what incentives or infrastructures are needed to further improve collaboration between social scientists and climate modelers? So should we revise or improve the scientific landscape with peer review publications, or what kind of policy impacts can actually lead to better collaboration between communities? And at the same time, we should ask ourselves, so how can a degree of democratization of science can be achieved by engaging non-academic stakeholders while maintaining or enhancing academic rigor? So this would be the set of questions that we'll be asking. And then in case you are interested, please approach me if you are interested to be interviewed, if you have some answers to these questions. Thank you very much, and I will give the floor back to the moderators.
So our next speaker and impulse giver will be Howard Burkhardt. Please pronounce your name. From the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And I think your presentation is there. So the floor is.
Thank you so much, Ines, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this morning session. Yeah, so I'll spend my few minutes reflecting a bit on options that we might have and some of the challenges related to thinking of political development pathways. In the plenary talk on Monday, Detlef van Vuuren showed this figure of 4 levels of ambition when it comes to revising and updating the SSP scenario framework. What I'll be talking about, and probably what most of the people on the panel will be reflecting on, fit somewhere between 3 and 4, between just updating, some of the core elements of the SSPs, the narratives and the projections, and then between that and thinking entirely new about what SSPs are and what they should be. So I'll be discussing specifically political development. What do we mean by political development? If you Google, you will find a host of different definitions. One may not necessarily be better or worse than another. Here's one I found when I Googled. I think what is key to political development, almost regardless of the definition you seek to rely on, is that it contains 2 core elements. One is about political institutions and governance, and one is about peace and security. And that's what I have in mind when I discuss political development. Political development is important for climate policy commitment, but also for implementation of these commitments. We heard a bit about that from Staffan yesterday in the concluding session. We might hear more about that, I don't know, today. And especially important for the kind of research I do, I come from a peace research institute, is that political development also is important in facilitating adaptation to climate change, reducing vulnerability, and also reducing climate risks thereby. In the existing portfolio, or at least in the original portfolio of SSPs, political development has not been quantified. And so, in effect, the SSPs tacitly assume that politics will function as they should, right? Across the board, across all pathways. This is unfortunate, since we know that political or variation in political development is an important explanation for variation in outcomes from climate hazards. And so SSPs, by implication, are poorly able to capture vulnerability of societies to climate hazards. The most likely, or the most used proxy for vulnerability in the SSP framework is then GDP per capita as an indicator of economic level of development. But that's an inefficient and incomplete proxy for vulnerability. And because of this, and because the SSP projections tacitly assume this optimal political world, the SSP-based impact assessments are quite likely to underestimate future risks and future impacts in regions that are currently and likely in the future vulnerable to climate hazards. I did a study with a colleague a few years back where we looked into this a little bit detail, where we focus on the GDP. Here you see a graph showing historical and projected economic growth for the least developed countries of the world in SSP3, which is sort of a more pessimistic future scenario. And you see that there is a dramatic change between observed and projected growth, because in the future, we assume that politics will work as normal. There is no conflict, right? And of course, the providers of these data, they acknowledge this, even in the abstract, which this quote is from, that external shocks are not accounted for. So what can we do about this? I will very briefly, and I realize time is running, but I think this is important. So I hope you will, Madam Chair, allow me a couple of extra minutes. The first option would be perhaps, and I would say that there are infinite, probably, number of options for how to think about integrating or expanding the SSPs to include political development. One option would be to think of political development factors as a function of existing SSP projections, right? That's a doable approach. It's a natural first step, you might say. In fact, it has already been done to some extent. Here's a study we did. Elizabeth was part of that also a few years back when we explored conflict implications of the SSPs into the long-term future. More recently, we also read a paper on governance implications of GDP and population and urbanization and education projections that are already in the SSP framework. So that's good. A limitation with these approaches, as good as they are, is that there is no feedback effect, right, from political development back onto the other drivers or the other dimensions of SSP. So if there is a conflict, conflict doesn't have an impact on future economic growth if we follow this approach. And as a consequence of this, results from this approach might be inconsistent with the underlying SSP narratives. Again, we could show this by focusing on the SSP world, and the Nature Sustainability article estimates or projects future quality of governance, and you would see that even in the SSP3 world, quality of governance will be better in the future than it is today. I don't think that is a worst possible imaginable future. Maybe SSP is not supposed to be the worst possible imaginable, but I think there's a need here to try to capture additional dimensions of vulnerability. Okay, second option would be to think a little bit more complex and see political and socioeconomic development as endogenous processes. This would be more consistent with our theoretical understanding of how economic and political development mutually influence each other, right? It would also then, by implication or by design, enable feedback effect from political development back onto economic development, for example, or education attainment. A limitation or a concern here is that this approach would be very complex and potentially also very sensitive to small changes in the model parameters. So that is something that would have to be explored further and kept in mind when developing these models. A third approach would be to think of political development completely decoupled from socioeconomic development. In that way, we could perhaps make future political development pathways in a quantified manner that would fit quite well with the underlying SSP narratives, because we do not have to relate to the GDP projections that already existed that might be problematic for some regions of the world. It also would potentially enable flexible combination where you could explore the socioeconomic development following the SSP2 world, but then you could combine that with alternative political development futures, right? And so you would get a broader set of alternative scenarios to play with. Again, this approach also, at least in its simple form, would not incorporate feedback effects between political and socioeconomic development. And not all of these envisionable combinations of political futures and economic futures would be meaningful. You wouldn't both follow the SSP1 or SSP5 world of rapid economic growth and have a dramatic increase in armed conflict and a dramatic deterioration of political institutions, for example. Most people would find that to be a not very plausible combination. All right, this is the final slide. Some additional consideration, and these are just some food for thought. No solutions here. First of all, I think we need, or we do need to expand the narratives currently embedded in the SSPs to better capture and in a more detailed manner political futures. And those narratives could then be used to guide further quantification of some of these development or political development indicators. Another question is, which indicator actually are we thinking of here? Okay, so I started by mentioning that by political development, we are envisioning on the one hand, institutions and governance, and then on the other, conflict and peace and security. But exactly which indicators? Are we talking about democracy? Are we talking about some type of governance effectiveness or quality of governance, which could be somewhat different? These are questions that need to be discussed and addressed, right? Oh, that's interesting order of bullet points. Yeah, and then should we also think of different pathways, or at least different indicators that capture domestic situation into the long-term future and international or geopolitical context? That's another question that isn't quite solved yet. And there might be different needs depending on what you're using the scenario framework for, whether you're exploring climate policy and mitigation options, or whether you're doing risk and impact assessment, for example. What would be the most relevant or ideal political development dimension and indicator could differ. If we want to have some projections that could catch everything, well, that would obviously have some influence for which indicator we choose. And there are a number of other considerations I haven't thought of and I haven't put on this slide, but these are just food for thought for the subsequent panel discussion. And let me just end by citing the Nature Climate Change study that came out as a consequence of the first scenario forum conference in Denver, which writes that initial progress on projections of governance and violent conflict, which I've already actually showed on the previous slide, should be broadened to include political institutions and integrated into the SSPs. I think that quote is very much still something we should pay attention to. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard, for very nicely setting the scene and for this keynote address, really laying out the different options of how modeling socio-political indicators could proceed and also raising important questions. So I think this is a very good input to our subsequent discussion. So just to say, my name is Ines Dombrowski. I'm from the German Development Institute, and I will now moderate the panel. And then in the end, I will hand back to Elizabeth for reflections on the session. So we will not go into questions right now already, but first have the panel inputs. But obviously, then after the panel inputs, you could also raise questions to Howard. And in terms of the panel, the way we will proceed is that we have 5 different inputs. And actually, I've changed the order compared to the program. So the suggestion is that we will first have 2 inputs that further try to underpin what has been said in the introduction. And then we would start with Chris and then Staffan. And then I would call upon Teresa. Are you Teresa? Okay, we haven't met yet. And Ian. And then last we will have an input from Elmar Griegler via Zoom, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. So all of you have 5 minutes, and I will now be more strict in the timekeeping for the panelists. So the first input is by Chris Wingens from the German Development Institute, who's working together with Julia Leininger, whom is also in the room. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And actually, it's quite nice to follow on that presentation because I really have a feeling, yeah, nice field, and we connect to that work. And yeah, after Julia and Staffan presented parts of our work yesterday evening in the plenary, today I'm happy to continue and follow up. And I'm going to concentrate more on political institutions and then one specific indicator. But Julia is also in the room, and I think happy to join the discussion later. And another person I definitely want to mention is Konstantin Ruhr, because he is an integral part of our modeling efforts, and he's our expert on violent conflict. And then to begin with, I have noted 2 main points here, and the third one that I still wanted to keep, but it's grayed out a little, but it's really well connecting to your 7th question. And number 1, political science does offer theories and indicators that can serve for narratives and as inputs for IMMs. And I think this connects very, very well to yesterday's presentation. And I will now focus on political institutions. But here in the second key point, research on political institutions is then highly relevant. And here I want to shortly highlight later our results of shared paper with PIC, led by Björn Sörgel, where we also contributed indicators for political institutions and peace and conflict. And this third point, I'm going to mention it later, but there's still a lot to do, but the relationship between IMM and social science is better than its reputation. And just think about your meetings yesterday and the day before here at the scenario forum. I really have the feeling we have lots of social scientists around, it was great, and also lots of great discussions. And I think, you really noticed that but more collaboration and change of incentive structures is then needed. So why political institutions? So theoretically, political institutions shape human behavior and they imply political decisions that are then binding collectively for whole societies. And as a result, strong and responsive political institutions are central preconditions for sustainable development and peace. And in the SDGs, they are a goal in themselves, but also function as an enabler for the other SDGs. But also then from a modeling perspective, it's great because political institutions are easier to predict than, for example, more volatile violent conflict events, and they are more stable over time. And this is also related to higher path dependencies. So the indicator we choose here in the study that I also quoted here is actually from VDEM, and it's the Equality Before the Law and Individual Liberty Index, so rule of law indicator. And this also connects to your first question, what indicators to use. And this indicator actually really well captures like also the essence of SDG 16. And I quote, like, promote the rule of law and ensure equal access to justice for all. And also includes elements of fundamental freedom, torture. And here you can see some of our results actually. And yeah, our projections started in 2015 to 2050. And here you can actually see that all the scenarios here have substantial improvements for that indicator. But our target value was actually 0.9. 0.9 is right at the top of the scale. So it's not reached in all of those projections. But I've also, yesterday, we also showed some updated versions of our projections. And I also want to show them here because I think they also connect very, very well to what you just showed, like SSP3 scenario. Yeah, it's really a tricky scenario here. And this is modeled along the SSP. So yeah, drawing on that, it's still that first step. But I want to get to my key points again and also an outlook. And there I can very much connect to what was just said before, because it would now be really interesting to see how at different points in the modeling framework, like these political science indicators that we are now talking about, are then actually maybe able to replace implicit assumptions and give some more empirical data for that, and maybe also work then as constraints and for calibration. And I think that will also be interesting to take up the point of more regionalization and also explore different sub-scenarios and expand the narratives. But I think we will draw on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for keeping the time. So I would then call upon Stefan Lindberg, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg and the director of the VDEM Institute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for being here, everyone. And I'll pick up on the assumed optimal political context, right? And speak about democracy. And now I was invited to make sort of a guest appearance yesterday on the panel. So I will just expand a little bit about that. So you talked about conflict, right? And in IR and political science, that's almost like the closest thing we have to an iron law, right? Democracies do not fight wars with each other. And democracies, especially really good democracies, have a much lower probability for any type of armed conflict. And that's the probability scale there that when you go down on democracy scale, then the probability goes up, right? And just think about this, what the implications are. We know conflict and war is terrible for anything that has to do with collaboration. Obviously, it's the antithesis of collaboration, war. And climate change requires collaboration between states. Imagine what would happen now. India's downfall on democracy has, and Howard Hegre was helpful in calculating the probability there. The risk of an armed conflict has gone up with 300%. Imagine what a conflict between India and Pakistan would mean. 2 nuclear powers. And look at that. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not so much of a surprise if we take these IR scholars' work into account. That's from when sort of Putin started to have power in Russia and to the end when he invaded Ukraine. Economic growth, one of the drivers. There's now a huge body of literature from recent years, very rigorous, very sort of all bells and whistles in terms of statistical analysis, synthetic control, and so on, showing a very robust relationship that democracy causes growth and more stable growth, and avoid the disasters. That's a sort of the tail end from Karl-Henrik Knudsen. Autocracies have all these very deep financial crises. And then you don't have resources for climate adaptation, you don't have, and so on and so forth, right? Also in terms of human health and human security, so the IPCC reports also talk about sort of mortality and infant mortality and all that as a consequence of climate change, right? Democracies, if you go from a really bad autocracy to a good democracy, infant mortality drops by 94%. So also in terms of those kinds of outcomes, there's a very strong and very robust, and these are studies, this is Lancet, British Medical Journal, that sort of stuff. It's not our political science journals from that nobody's ever heard of, except political scientists, right? So, okay. And I talked about this yesterday, right? And again, it's, if I put it that way, I don't know how many people are political scientists here, but it's again, it's sort of the Nature Climate Change, environmental research letter, and those kinds of journals. It's not, again, our journals. Very robust relationship directly on the outcome. So in terms of assuming optimal, you're sort of assuming a world where all countries are democracies, right? If a majority of countries now are autocracies in the world, 51.5%. Yes, yeah, exactly. According to my timer too. But if we follow the trend that we have today and lose many more, we've lost 32 democracies in the last 20 years. Continue that trend, then you have to downgrade all the scenarios and add another 1.6% in terms of global warming. That's pretty significant. Now, the long-term trend from 1789 here and onwards, of course, is upward with these sort of ups and downs in terms of, but you see at the tail end there, it's going down. If you look at that, I showed that yesterday. We're in a world where all regions of the world, levels of democracy are going down. We're back to 1989 levels right now, 70% of the world population. And that's significant because those are the 70% that cannot apply pressure upwards. So the apply pressure upwards and don't have the institutions where that public pressure for good public goods can be translated into then better climate action. So that's sort of the big problem. And on that note, let me say thank you, Madam Chair, for the extra 30 seconds I got.
Thank you, Stefan. So now I would like to invite Teresa Scarvenius. And Teresa is an associate professor in the Department of Planning at the University of Aalborg in Copenhagen. And
Yeah, no, I don't have a presentation. I thought it was without presentation.
right,
so I'm
no,
just
you're
have my
really
notes.
very welcome to do it with audio slides. So that's really up to you.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Yes,
thanks
super.
a lot for being with us. And the
Yeah,
floor
I'm
is
happy
yours.
to be here, and I think it's really interesting. This whole panel is really addressing a lot of interesting stuff. What I'm going to talk about is the predictive capacity of the social sciences. How do we include all these important stuff and knowledge we know about the development of democracies, which I'm also have been studying for the last 10, 15 years. But I think it's really interesting though how the scientific discipline has developed for the last 20 years with all these enhanced computer technologies, where I think we as humans are really fascinated about what our models can do. But I think it's really interesting. How can we actually make climate science into a predictive science? How can we actually do all these modeling? I'm as a social scientist, I don't know the technical details about it, but I know about that we cannot predict the future. So it's really hard actually to understand how can we do all these modeling? How is the IVC actually functioning? And when I see into the text and the details, I can see that they actually say that the way the predictive capacity of the climate sciences actually derives from them including social science. So it's a way that they say, okay, we know something about population, we know something about growth, we know about how societies may evolve. And if we include that into our climate science, then we can kind of predict the future. And they also claim that this way of integrating disciplines will be a more communicative tool. So they do it on the purpose of communicating better to policymakers. So the problem is then, can we actually have a social science that have this predictive capacity? How can we integrate it? And what I would like to add is really that we should be really, really careful about thinking social science as a predictive science. Because now the previous speaker just talked about the iron laws within the social science, but generally speaking, there's a consensus about that we do not have the laws within societies and behaviors, because behavior and societies are completely different matters. So even though economics, they try to extrapolate and have laws about people, how they will behave if the prices rises or etc. Generally speaking, those of us who have a more deeper understanding of how societies work, I myself have been really interested in understanding institutional capacity in democracies and exactly how they decline. All that cannot be measured or quantified, or at least it's very difficult to do it in a predictive way, because obviously we can look at it on a historical level, and that is really, really interesting. And then the question is really, how can we use the historical data to in terms of inform the way we move forward? But we should be really careful about how we could extrapolate and say, how will societies evolve over the next 100 years? So my point is really here, we should be careful about understanding the predictive capacity of the social science and also therefore of the climate sciences. So can we do predictions at all, and what is the use for them? But if we should, I know I have short time here, so if we should kind of improve, and I think there's a lot of sessions here at this conference which is really interesting how to improve the scenarios. And I think I have two ways to improve the scenarios. And one is really to include these so factual knowledge about our society, because right now it's at a very macro level that we have socio-economic factors. It's only population and economic growth, but we do need to have a much more detailed and historically based and factually based understanding of how societies may evolve. And we also need, and it was a little bit mentioned as well early in the previous speakers, that we need to have this normative account into. And obviously a lot of scientists are scared of including normative considerations, but this is a normative field. This is climate science is not just about describing how the society or climate changes. It is a moral question about whether we want to do something about it or not. Therefore, we cannot make these models that is just like absent from moral considerations. And when we do include moral consideration, then it's about including how is democracy evolved. Will these different scenarios fit into a more equal society, a more undemocratic society? How is the different values distributed? And my point is really that, yes, we should try to enhance the models because that's what we have now, but we should also be aware of that if we include all this factual knowledge, historical knowledge, and normative values, then it actually might be very difficult to make scenarios at all. And maybe we should think about in the future to have a different approach to how we translate and communicate climate science into society, politics, and those who still listen, because one of the issues is really when we have decline in democracies, decline in global institutions, then actually nobody listens to research anymore. So when people still listen, let's try to think about really hard how we can communicate the knowledge we actually want to provide in the best way. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for your provocative input. And then I would like to call upon Ian Yu from University College Cork, where he's a senior research fellow. And I think you're also working in the public service.
Thank you. So, thanks very much. I already feel very much at home here after listening to the last presentations, and especially what Teresa has just said in terms of the normative absolutely has to be included. It has to be our starting point almost. So I'm going to talk in 5 minutes just to give you a flavor of what the work that we're doing at University College Cork. This is a transdisciplinary project. I'm based within an energy modeling group, although I'm not an energy modeler, and it's trying to take this transdisciplinary approach and framing to expand what the energy modeling people are doing. So very much they've come from this technological viewpoint, very much like the SSPs are, but we're doing this very much discussive. There's about 20 of us from different disciplines, from politics, economics, technology, psychoanalysis, and so on. And we work together in terms of trying to figure out, write papers together and do events together and trying to figure out sort of deep institutional change. And I'm saying in terms of the normative part that Therese mentioned, the title of the project is Sustainability and Human Development. And I think these two things can't be separated. So the project Deep Institutional Innovation for Sustainability and Human Development is based on these premises. So that achieving sustainability requires deep transformation in multiple social institutions in society. It needs changes in politics, in economics, in technology, the way that technology is developed, in religion, in gender, and education. And all of these things have to be put on the table at the same time. It's almost, we need to take this whole of society perspective, because that's where the solutions lie. The solutions don't lie in looking at technology alone or looking at politics alone. These institutions are so deeply interconnected, they all need to be put on the table at the same time, and the discussion on that basis. And as I said, these deep institutional changes are needed across all of these institutions, because we're faced not only with climate change as a crisis, but as we've heard here, biodiversity crisis, geopolitical crises, crisis in economic inequality within societies, and so forth. So we have this whole range of crises that we're facing. And the third point, transformation, I mentioned in one arena is deeply coupled with transformation in others. And these transformations require an absolute normative basis for them. If we don't have a normative container for these transformations, then history shows us that they go in very, very difficult, dangerous directions. So we've come from a socio-technical perspective. This diagram is Frank Eel's certain multi-level perspective. One idea of how this is socio-technical change rather than whole of society change, but we're using this framing to begin with. So at the bottom, you see, just very briefly on this, at the bottom, you see change can begin at very small technological niches, new lifestyles, new technology, and so on. They find it very difficult to break into the existing regime because of incumbents, path dependence, and so forth. But the top level, the landscape level, is the one I'd like to point to here. That at landscape level, which is one of deep values, Johann Schott calls this, that we're living in an era of industrial modernity, where the values of separation from nature, nature is a limitless resource, techno-optimism, the primacy of material progress, all of these things are the paradigm, the water that we're swimming in, that we hardly question. But what's needed for transformation to both sustainability and greater human development is a rupture with those values. So in the project so far, we've been working our way through each of the 6 social institutions in the project, trying to rethink what are the paradigm shifts in politics that are needed in democracy. What are the paradigm shifts in economics, like beyond growth, in technology, beyond creative destruction, and accepting that technology will create destruction and allowing that to happen. It'll all turn out well in the end. Similarly within religion and within gender. 1 minute left. So we had a workshop just of the whole 20 or 25 of us in the IIAS community, and really looking at this box and asking people. We were nervous before we did this, because this is like putting the ocean on the table, huh? Put all of these things on the table and then ask people to talk about them. You know, what are the things from your disciplinary perspective, what are the major transformations that are needed in politics in terms of ideas, in terms of the organizations, in terms of social practices, and similarly across all the other fields. In religion, what are the main paradigmatic ideational ideas that are needed? What are the changes in organizations that are needed? So we had this discussion. As I say, we were nervous because it was like boiling the ocean, putting everything on the table at the one time. And on I have the video, it's a 25-minute video, I have to finish, that explains this in much more detail. But this is the preliminary scenario that we came up with as a result of that workshop. And you can see that it's based on progress requires a recognition of the deeply interconnected nature of all these social institutions, that the reforms need to be based fundamentally on a normative direction. And that then we can begin to think about what are the fundamental ideational changes that are needed in each of these areas. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ian, for this very broad and fundamental perspective. And we would then like to call upon Elmar Kriegler to join us virtually. So Elmar is the head of the Research Department Transformation Pathways at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research and professor for integrated assessment at the University of Potsdam. And we are glad, Elmar, that you can be with us at least through the virtual room.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ines, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me in the room? Yes, I see nodding, so that's great. Yeah, I'm very happy to be able to be part of this exciting workshop, at least remotely, and I would have wished to be there in person, but that's unfortunately not possible. I would like to make 7 points in 5 minutes. Let's see how this works out. So I'm an integrated assessment modeler and coming in from a modeling perspective, but we have cooperated with the colleagues from the German Development Institute in various contexts. The paper by Björn Sörgel that Alvos mentioned, but we also have a project called SHAPE, where we look into new sustainable development narratives together with Ines and Ariel and team. So my first point is that there's really increasing recognition and very strong recognition now that socio-political factors need to play a key role in environmental and climate change scenario building. So really, if you look at the situation today, and I think the developments over the past years have reinforced that we are facing this fourfold challenge about establishing peace and managing conflict, lowering social and economic inequality, then solving this twin environmental challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss we have heard a lot about during this forum, and finally managing the digital revolution, or the second machine age that as it has been called. And those problems are intertwined. 2 of them are obviously with humanity since thousands of years. 2 of them are new. And there's a clear recognition that we need to think about them together in order to be able to solve this problem. Second point is that if you look at scenarios, a core part of those scenarios are narratives. They're used to inform quantitative projections, but more importantly, they are devices to connect different domains of knowledge and also to connect with different groups of stakeholders and to bridge across scales from global to local. So the narratives are really, really important. And the question I would raise here in the room is, what are narratives of socio-political world futures that are systematic in terms of covering key possibilities, providing structure, and are grounded in our empirical understanding, as, for example, is now being developed using the VDEM database. So I believe that if such socio-political futures are formulated by the governance and social science community, those would have a large resonance in the scenario building community. My third point is then, when it comes to quantitative modeling, of course, we require a mathematical model that can be implemented. My guess is that mathematical models of socio-political transformations are in its infancy, and it's probably too long to wait until some of them are mature enough to be integrated in integrated assessment models. The closest candidate here might be, which was mentioned already by Ian, the socio-technical transition theory, that is being formalized in various ways. So it has this multi-level perspective about technological niche or institutional niche, then these socio-technical regimes and the overall landscape. There are some interactions between the IIM community and this community, and there are some papers there which I encourage you to look at, where strategies are discussed, where socio-technical transition modeling is used as an input, which is called iterating strategy, or where everything is to be put into one model, which is the most challenging and maybe probably not the best way to do it. And another one is called bridging strategy, where those things run in parallel, inform each other, and are used for an appraisal of pathways, of transformation pathways. Fourth point is really that in the absence of good mathematical models, and I think that's the situation we are in, there's a lot of other things that can be done. And I think the preferential way, or a good way, is to include socio-political factors via constraints, via scenarios for associated socioeconomic drivers, or as part of the scenario appraisal. So a bit akin to this bridging strategy that was proposed in the context of socio-technical transition theory. So this requires, of course, socio-political scenario building that stands on its own and can be validated against near-term trends. And a fruitful approach that has emerged in this context is if you have near-term trends that you can formulate and measure and extrapolate, and you do have a narrative for a long-term vision of a world, socio-political world future, you can use these two building blocks to connect the two to build a scenario. Finally, and my time is up, I guess, just very quickly, skipping point 5, going to point 6. Equity and justice is increasingly a key topic for environmental change scenario building. We have seen it here at the forum. There was a session on that. There's lots of work going on, looking into income and consumption inequality and the impact of transformation on those, as well as into employment effects. And I think that would be a good entry point for further collaboration, to add this socio-political dimension. There are other critical dimensions that are currently underexplored, and those are governance indicators. Halvard had a few examples in the beginning where these are also tackled. So rule of law, degree of participation, transparency, effectiveness, autocracy versus democracy, and the other one is management of conflicts. Finally, to the last question, what does it take to collaborate? Let me just say that it takes two to tango, of course. So what it takes from the side of the integrated assessment and environmental change modeling community is really a deep understanding that transformative change takes more than just changing some techno-economic systems. It's not just systems change, so it's also societal change, so that this openness is required. On the other side, we will need forward-looking social scientists that like to talk about the future, which doesn't mean they don't need to, of course, talking about the past is important, but like to talk about the future in terms of all scenarios. And so that's where we can make the connection. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Elmar, for your reflections from a IIM perspective. So I would now like to invite the panelists to come up front and sit here on this table. I think we need to add one chair, and I will stand there in the corner. And yeah, I will also invite questions by the audience soon. So please get prepared to ask your question. And yeah, do we have somebody who could you help us with the mic? This one. And I think we will also have Elmar hopefully showing on the. Okay, can he be in the big window or? So I think we had very promising input statements showing really a broad range of the debate that we are discussing here about the possible integration and of socio-political factors into the IIM models. And I guess the two overarching questions that were raised is first, should we actually integrate socio-political factors into the models? And I have the impression that there is maybe a bit of controversy at the table. And yeah, maybe we start with that question, and maybe you want to comment on this from your perspective. Stefan.
Thank you. And thanks, Elmar. I thought your points and your suggestions were really, really helpful. And let me just say quickly on your last point, social scientists who are willing to look forward into the future. And it's, I think, one of the big problems on our side that and not the least in political science, where I come from, people tend to say, well, we can look at the past, but we are not in the business of making predictions for the future. And along the lines of your comment that we don't have laws, I would say this is based on a deep misconception about how the STEM sciences work. So I would encourage all of us who are social scientists to think about this. I can give you many examples of this. And I've discussed this with my colleagues in physics, in medicine, and go down the line so much over the past 5 to 10 years. Let me just, in this context, make one metaphor. So we're talking about climate change. And there are predictions about increasing global temperatures will lead to things like more heat waves. We've had a heat wave here. Now, the climate scientists cannot tell you where that heat wave is going to happen and on what date, right? There's going to be more of them. And there's going to be some areas that have higher and lower probabilities for getting heat waves. That's exactly what we can do too. We talk about increasing or lowering probabilities, right? We have pretty good, if we're not talking about iron laws that have no exceptions. There are very few of those in the STEM area, right? And we should be less pushing as social scientists. We should be doing less of pushing ourselves down and saying we can't say anything about the future. We can, much more than we think often. So Elmar, I think you're right. We need to step forward and be willing to try and be more helpful. Thank you.
I think you can pass over to Teresa, who's raised her hand.
So I would say, yes, we should try to improve the current scenarios because that's what we have right now. And they're so important for the whole way the world consider climate change. So obviously we need to improve it because this is what we have. That is the system we have now. But we should think about more carefully about what can we actually use these scenarios for. And obviously, yes, we can make some predictions, and I agree with that. But it's again, they cannot be made so in a nice pictures. And what I actually want to argue is really that it's also a question about what is the founding of these scenarios. And I think the narratives could be improved. So it's not just the modeling, it's also the way we consider the different possible futures. And to my account, the current ones are very speculative and do not take into account how we actually may think the world will evolve for the next 100 years. So what we should think about is really what can we include in the modeling, but also how can we improve the narratives. And again, then we should be, the third thing should be, we should reflect upon, is it the right strategy? Because if we go back to the first reports, the way they thought about scenarios was a completely different way. So it was much more about saying, okay, we have the prediction of what is the emissions level, what if we continue, then we can predict how much of the carbon budget we will use. And then the scenarios was based on different policy scenarios. So it was really about saying what type of policies can we make in different scenarios. And I think that discussion and debate would I really like to have, to say, were that actually a better way of understanding and communicating climate science to the outside world?
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, and
Is it
Chris.
okay?
Chris,
Yeah.
maybe Howard first, and
Yeah, okay. The order, yeah, okay. Yes, thanks. Interesting reflections. The scenarios, as I see them, are not intended to be predictions. And so we're not trying to predict how the future will look, right? We have some alternative scenarios that represent alternative futures. None of them is an attempt to try to identify how the future will be, but they represent some alternative ways in which the future may evolve, right? And then we can explore based on our best understanding of how those factors influence outcomes we're interested in, food insecurity, conflict, democracy, whatever, based on our current understanding of how these socioeconomic factors affect these outcomes. So if we are unable to predict any particular event, that doesn't mean that we are unable to explain broader structural processes and changes. Prior to remote sensing, weather forecasting was pretty much just looking out the window, right? I'm looking at the weather today. In 85–90% of the cases, depending a little bit of where we are in the world, if you're in Norway, lower percentages, a prediction about the future being similar to today or tomorrow being similar to today would be accurate, right? Tomorrow is likely to be quite similar to today. We could do the same with conflict, right? Look at where conflicts are today. It's not going to be exactly the same next year, but it's going to be quite similar, right? And so there are certain underlying structures. And so with scenarios, we can play around with assumptions about how these structures could change into the future, such that we have one more optimistic future. And then we can say, okay, so in this optimistic future, what will be the implications for climate policy? What will be the implications for vulnerability, et cetera, et cetera. And then we could play around with different assumptions about more negative evolution in these structures. And so I just wanted to get away from this thinking that we are locked into an attempt to try to predict outcomes, because we're just going to model outcomes as a consequence of different stylized scenarios.
Yeah, thank you. Because I also wanted to really raise that point that it's not forecasting. It's like exploring different scenarios. And I also have the feeling it's quite good to look back where the scenarios are actually coming from, than looking at like energy, land transformation system modeling, and then to what way or how they developed and what are they used for at the moment. And I think there we can really well connect, because I think communication and good communication of like the scenario outputs and how to present them, not only in the IPCC, but also to the broader public, and then to translate that is like key. And especially when we are then thinking about integrating more political factors, I think that communication is also like really getting trickier, but also necessary.
And Chris, if you could hand over to Ian, he wants to comment on this.
So, thank you. I guess just reflections on whether to integrate political factors into the existing framework. I go back to Ariel's question at the beginning of the purpose of the research. And to my mind, the most urgent thing we need to be doing is to be reforming, transforming our existing social institutions. So it isn't really about predicting the future or looking at scenarios. If that vehicle helps to make the argument and produce the evidence that we absolutely need to be changing our political structures and our economic structures and so forth, then I think that's really valid if it's a way to further that agenda. I guess the second reflection is just something on, what counts as authoritative evidence? What counts when it comes to making arguments and getting arguments accepted? And I think there is history tells us as much as model in terms of how societies can collapse. Yeah, and we're almost in that situation at the moment. So historical and contemporary evidence, lived experience is as much valid authoritative knowledge as mathematical model. And we should take that into account.
Yeah, Teresa wants to react, but maybe
I just want to clarify that I think it's like a confusion, because I'm not saying that social sciences cannot predict something. It's really about we can use the historical data to understand what trends we are looking into. And what we actually right now is looking into is decline democracy, lack of global climate governance, etc. So we can predict that. And therefore we can also predict that we will see increase in temperatures, etc. And now I'm really confused about what is the use of the scenarios actually, if it's just about these not predicting, but just thinking, speculating about future possible scenarios that is unrelated to the facts we actually know how the world is currently developing. So that's maybe, I don't know if we have time for it, but it's interesting understanding why should we use it if we don't know which one is useful, which one is likely. And I know it's behind the theory and the model, the methodology behind the scenarios that we shouldn't think in likelihoods. But I really, really strongly disagree in that approach, because then it makes actually the scenarios a little bit irrelevant, because we know how the world is developing right now. And it's I think that should be included in our understanding and how the world is progressing right now.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to give the floor to Elmar. And then I see that there's movement in the room. And so I will skip my second question and will then open up the floor for our questions in the room. So Elmar first.
Yeah, thank you, Ines. So very fascinating discussion. I agree with what has been said by Staffan and Halvard about prediction. And scenarios are not about prediction. Simple prediction, as you understand, also not about likelihoods, because it's impossible to predict what emissions will be in 10 years. But I think, Teresa, the point you're making is very important. It's also not the case that we can say we have nothing to do with prediction. It's completely detached from reality, because then scenarios become irrelevant. So what's the fine line here? And I think the line here is to say, under certain assumptions, knowing some of the structural relationships and the empirical trends, we are building a scenario of what would happen under such assumptions, assuming some policies. And we contrast this particular scenario with another scenario or a set of other scenarios to understand differences that might emerge under different assumptions, under different courses of action. And that's the information, the difference between the scenarios that is then fed into the policy process. I think it is also catering to the fact that we are not looking at a closed system from outside, like an alien race that looks at Earth and then tries to predict what humans are doing, but we are trying to inform a decision-making process that might change course. So we don't want to predict that part, but we want to inform that part. And I think that's the critical thing. And in this sense, integrated assessment modeling is not so, is probably related to what can be attempted in the social sciences here, if this direct communication with the policymakers is possible. The original question, Ines, on what should socio-political variables be included, and my answer is yes to that. But I do think, since this is a big challenge, it's important to try to compartmentalize a bit and look at different ways how this can be done. And broadly speaking, and it was touched upon in the introductory comments, one is to try to build socio-political scenarios with a narrative and some quantitative descriptions, and then try to merge that somehow with a scenario modeling. For me, this is right now the most promising. Trying to build a socio-political transition model into the model themselves, I think is a much longer way off. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma. And actually, yeah, it would be really interesting now to dig into this debate deeper, but I also want to give the floor the opportunity to raise issues and comments. And I see, okay, 1, 2, 3, 7 hands up. My suggestion is we take you all in a row and you try to be very brief and to the point, and then each panelist has the opportunity to answer, to give one answer, because we also still have Elizabeth with a wrapping up for the session. So I just start in that corner and move to the left from my side. So please briefly introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Henrik Karlsson, Stockholm Environment Institute. This is really a fascinating session. It's kind of a foundational session for almost everything that we do in this community, I think. So congratulations to the organizers. Perhaps we should have a conference only on those more foundational issues around social science and scenarios. I have 2 brief comments. First on, it seems that we talk about physics implicitly, as physics has 100% predictability. That is not true. Physics has 2 main theories, general relativity with 100% predictability, and quantum mechanics with only statistical predictability. And perhaps this can help to sort out a little bit of the confusion of what we mean with predictability. The other comment is that we should remember all at the time that we work with sets of scenarios, not individual scenarios. The discussion tends to go over to rank individual scenarios in terms of likelihoods, etc., and talk about predictability or likelihood of individual scenarios. We always work with sets of scenarios. And implicitly, I would argue that we tend to say that this set of scenarios, to some degree, predict or capture the key uncertainties of the future. So I think we should be careful about the notion of set properties versus properties of individual scenarios. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these comments. Then, yes, please.
Shin Asoyama from National Institute for Environmental Studies, Japan. And thank you. This is very fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I think one of the things that incorporating the social political factors into the modeling is very difficult, and that's why it's very important. But at the same time, I think we should not I think it's misleading to think about the quantifying and then different outcome, quantified outcome, how the different scenario can produce. That's a long way to do that, because modelers wanted to see the differences of like numbers, but actually what that matter for the social political factors is qualitative differences. So living in democracy is fundamentally different living in autocracies, but it might be possible to produce the same climate outcome. So I think we should not to do that and modeling of social political factors in some way to produce in different numbers. Then what I wanted to raise a question is about so perhaps the question perhaps to Stefan, because there's a democracy now back into 1989, which is pretty much end of the Cold War, and then we have a 30 years expansion of liberal political orders, and this seems to be end of this era, end of the history, as Francis Fukuyama said. So I think what we need to have is more what will happen this next 30 years until 2050s. What is the plausible future scenarios about international political orders? And if we can come up with some plausible maybe 3 or 4 international political orders, that might be interesting step forward to think about maybe more incorporating social political factors. Sorry for long question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And then I would like to hand over the mic to the gentleman here.
Well, okay, thanks. I'm Jim Skee, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, and I was going to be really long-winded, but I'll do my best on this. And just to say, we've used the word models and scenarios a bit interchangeably here, I've heard from the floor, and we need to be very careful about that, because the models play a particular role in quantifying a scenario and you're looking for the internal consistency of it. And I think we're more talking about the scenarios here, which are the things that you can use to constrain when you use the models as tools. So I see two roles for the social sciences. One is helping to improve the narratives and the storylines around the SSPs. And just to say, just before I took my job, I went and had a conversation with Shell Group Planning about how they did their scenarios, a very offline discussion, I should say. And the very interesting thing is they made a much, much better use of a cross set of disciplines in constructing their scenarios than anything I ever saw in the academic sphere. They had cultural anthropologists, they had political scientists, they had international relations people thinking through how they did things. And I think, you know, really bringing social scientists from a spectrum of disciplines into that process would be very good. And just on the storylines and the point about predictability or otherwise, I do think there is a sense of predictability about the near term. We understand where we are, but when we start to look 20, 30 years ahead, that's where you need contingency and different scenarios. And it disturbs me a bit with the SSPs. They have these abrupt changes of direction in the base year, which I don't think are realistic. I think we know more about the next 5 to 10 years than than is probably represented. And I do think that actually the social sciences would help with some of the quantification about the way the models are constrained and directed. And I think there are things that could come in there. So just to say, it was my aspiration to get more social sciences into this cycle for Working Group 3, partially successful, but a lot more to be done.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the bottom line.
Hi, I'm Haley Steele from UC Davis, the Cultural Studies program. Cultural Studies theorists actually sometimes consider us to be a predictive social science, for better or worse. Quick question for Stephen. I was thinking, how do your numbers handle the behavior of imperial democracies, such as the United States' recent history of covert imperialism in Chile, Guatemala, Honduras, etc.? How do you factor in imperial behaviors of democracies in relation to other nations? And then for Chris, I was thinking you used a very specific VDEM indicator, equality under law. Do you think it's better to break things down in socio-political differences into indicators, rather than using broad ideologically laden terms like democracy? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. And then I'd like to move here to the middle.
Thanks a lot. My name is Nina van Uxkull. I'm from the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. And I had a related point where I was wondering, I mean, given the different mechanisms, is it useful to have a one indicator, or should we break it down? I think this is a really important question, but related question would also be the question of endogeneity, right? I mean, we have the democracy matters in different ways, but they're also affected by economic development and conflict. So I think thinking if you have more input on kind of actually getting the scenarios to work and getting kind of the modeling done, I think it would be really interesting to discuss.
Thanks for your question. And then Julia.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So before I say what I want to say, let me say that I'm always struck with that notion of social sciences, because I mean, social scientists are involved in scenarios, and I mean, the indicators are built by social scientists. And if we would take the perspective around and not take the scenarios forum as a forum where different modeler communities meet, we could also have a meeting where all the different social science communities that are here meet, because I mean, amongst us here, I mean, we are from different schools, right? For instance, I assume, given your comments. So, I mean, we are as diverse. So what I want to say is, I think there's a lot of social science in here already, but nevertheless, we need more, of course, but just to raise the awareness. Diversity is on all sides here. So my first point, I think scenarios in contrast to predictions have a real advantage. And the advantage is we set a target and we know where we want to go, right? And to achieve that target. And that gives also social science theory, and we didn't talk about theory here yet, an opportunity to come in on two levels, because we have meso theories that tell us a lot about what works, what kind of governance and political institutions do we need to achieve energy goals, for instance. But that is something that can inform that in case studies and so on. But then we also have macro theories, and there I would contest what James said. Actually, they shouldn't go only into the constraining and into the defining the pathways and narratives, but they should go into the models as well, because those are fundamental factors that in history and in the future will decide whether that targets are met or not. And I mean, I have no idea yet, and that's something we discussed, Emma, right? How to include it, but I think we should do justice to the fact that conflict, war, and certain sets of institutions make a difference.
Thank you. So I have one final from the original round of hands, and yeah, due to time constraints, that would be the last audience input.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll try to keep it short. Matthias Garschagen, LMU University of Munich, and I'm a human geography and a social human geographer and a social scientist, and so I very much appreciate that panel. Nevertheless, I want to play with devil's advocate a little bit to the own community and push back on one point in particular, but I've raised it more as a comment. I mean, when we were, and that's the point, Halbert, you made. So don't take it wrong, but we can take this to a coffee break. I mean, the argument that in the SSPs there's an underlying assumption that institutions work perfectly and political systems work perfectly and so forth. I don't fully follow that. I think, and when we were in 2012 in Boulder and that workshop, Elma was there, Chris was there, and so forth. We had social scientists in the room, and particularly if you look into SSP 3 and 4 and the narratives and the framework they provide, they're all about non-functioning institutions. They're all about political conflicts internationally, within countries, and the effects thereof. So I really don't follow that argument to say the framework isn't there in the SSPs, and there's this sense in the room, there's a big gap or a big clash here, and we have to rethink this more fundamentally and so forth. We can do this, but I don't fully follow that clash, because I think the framework is there. The question is really to our own community: have we used the last 10 years to actually fill it with life, to provide the extensions that are needed and so forth, to provide the indicators that are needed, a little bit along Elma's lines. And so I don't raise it as a question, more as a comment, and we can take it to the coffee break. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Provocation, maybe. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And I'm really sorry that we need to stop the collection. And I would now hand over. I mean, each panelist has the chance to still say something. I would start with the more specific questions to Staffan and Chris, and but then I would also give you the opportunity to react. And I would like to to ask the audience to bear with us to eat a little bit into the coffee break. Thanks. Staffan.
Okay, let's see if I caught all the specific questions, but let me just say to Elmar and to everyone else and all that, if I spoke about predictions, I didn't mean to. That predictions are the important part here in for the SSPs and so on. And I do believe that I think I was encouraging us as a community to be a little bit more bold about working with assumptions, and under certain assumptions and the existing knowledge we have, we can actually build what could be socio-political possible and internally consistent pathways that could feed in here. I'm not exactly sure how, because I'm not into the models at that level of detail. Now, the imperial democracies are not in the measure, because that's something you want to be able to study, how different countries affect each other. We measure is independent political units on their own. And I think we have to be also getting out of our comfort zone when it comes to endogeneity, because that's about feedback loops, and that's completely. I mean, we're too used to this. Oh, we need to know the independent effect of X on Y. And endogeneity is a threat to that, right? But here we're talking about feedback loops over long times, of periods of 50 or 100 years. And we should become comfortable with thinking in those terms. And then I agree with a lot of what was said, and we're already over time. So I think, but I also want to say that I think a lot of qualitative differences can be quantified, and that will be helpful here. We do that a lot. So. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe then hand over to Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the great comments, because I think discussion is really going on. And for that point on the indicator, the rule of law indicator, actually you have to consider there's also quite a history and a point where we have to start. And I think, yes, it started also by looking at the SDGs and identifying that there was a paper on it on targets basis and looking at SDGs and different indicators. And I would also make the point, like theoretically and conceptually, that rule of law is a good indicator to begin with, because it's quite stable over time, path dependent, and of course closely interlinked to the other variables we are looking at. And this is also feeding into discussion before. And just making one brief point, because I know we time constraints, I would also emphasize that point on collaboration and communication, because I think collaboration is key at this point, and we really noticed that, like political scientists bubble and more modelers bubble. But then communication and translating all the thoughts, that is a key issue, but it's a great opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe you hand over to Robert, and maybe you can comment on the endogeneity problem.
I would love to, but let's do that during a coffee break. Matthias. Thanks for raising your comment, because that gives me an opportunity to clarify. I do not dispute that politics and political development is part of the SSPs. They are obviously in the narratives. Fully agreed. That was not my point. My point is that in the quantified projections to represent the SSPs, political development is nowhere to be found, right? And it's even worse than that, because if you look into the conditional convergence economic models that are being used to project future GDP growth, those models assume no growth disruptions. There is no conflict in the future in these models, which then produce economic growth projections that completely depart from observed growth in the recent past in unstable parts of the world. That's the only point I was making. Thanks.
Thank you. And Teresa, do you want the next?
Thanks for all the comments and the great debate. I think it also clarifies a lot of things, because if the scenarios is the purpose of the scenario is not to predict so much, then I actually don't think you need so much social science, because then you can just do the speculation based on different premises. But if you want to be more predictive, then it's important to know more about the society. And I think actually we should be more predictive, because I'm actually pretty scared about how the world is developing right now, both politically, climate-wise, etc. So I do think I would like to know more about how we can predict how it will evolve, how few democracy will be in the future, and also how bad the climate changes will be. So, and I think it's actually pretty easy, because Julia, I think, talked about targets, and I didn't completely understand that, because to me, climate science is just about having this carbon budget. And I think that makes a perfect target. And then the question is really, we should address is really, how can we have different pathways to meet this budget, or even not to avoid that. And just, I think it was a helpful comment about the short term and long term. I think actually it may be relevant to think more about that and say the social science might be very useful for the short-term prediction, because we can actually predict what will happen within the next 10 years or so, or at least we can know some about it. And then with the more speculative narratives for the 100 years, then there could be other more quantified ways of approaching that, because the other ones is more about capacity, and it is less useful to quantify that, because it may be possible, but at least we should be careful about that. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah. And
So,
then
thank you.
over to Ian.
I guess I'd just like to make a brief comment about democracy, and our understand. I think we need a new narrative for democracy. And I think this is relevant also about if we begin to think about what quantification, what metrics we would use. And to my mind, the definition of democracy is a defense against dangerous leadership. To my mind, that's historically how it has evolved. The rule of law as protection for individual citizens, elections about getting rid of leaders who don't stay in power for so long, human rights, and so forth. So I think the historical evolution of democracy fits in this narrative of containment or protection against dangerous leadership, which then affects all of society. I think we need a new narrative of democracy that takes that definition of dangerousness not just from a human-centered anthropocentric viewpoint, but also dangerousness towards biodiversity, dangerousness towards climate. And so I think on these measures, we may not have any democracies. So arguments then about, is the United States a democracy, is Europe democracy, and so forth. I think all of them are imperfect. All of them need transformation if we're going to get towards sustainability and linked human flourishing. And so I think that's important to think about in terms of the metrics that we would use if we're going to put political indicators. Do we put political indicators of existing conceptions of institutions, or do we rethink those about what they need to be?
Thank you, Ian, for these fundamental reflections on democracy. Emma, do you also still want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just
sorry.
Just very, very quickly, very inspiring discussion. I agree with what Henrik said, that this is a very fundamental discussion to what we are trying to achieve here with the scenario building and informing the policy process. I heard this great suggestion to have a conference on this or a smaller workshop on this particular topic to have more time. I think that's a great suggestion. Also, Julia pointed out, what about us scenario people and modelers coming to a social science conference and turning it around a bit? And I think that's an interesting exercise as well. So if there is an opportunity and there are sessions, I would very much, sessions can be organized, I would very much encourage that. I believe that there was a comment or question, and I agree with the statement saying that not socio-political differences and socio-political factors do not always need to result in differences in environmental outcomes like emissions or so. And that is true. But if you look at the problem in its full complexity, linking in the topic of inequality, for example, and other topics relevant for the SDGs, we will hardly find an area that would not be affected. So I think trying to make this integration is really important. And I agree with the comment saying, let's do some scenario building on the socio-political side, particularly in this situation where the world order as we know it is unraveling. It's very hard to see how it can be maintained given what has happened and what is happening right now. And so there's a strong need for these socio-political scenario building. And I would be very interested in engaging in it, but mostly, of course, because I'm not an expert in this, just following it. So I would really encourage your community to do that. And finally, just I've heard Theresa mention it. So if you really want to predict, then it's good to have the social sciences. If you just want to speculate, you can speculate yourself. Sorry, Theresa, for paraphrasing you in such a way, which you I guess is you didn't imply like this. And I think it's really about. So I think the word speculation is not the word here to use, but rather to exploration is the word here, to inform decision-making processes. And we need all the knowledge we can get. Like, for example, integrated assessment models need energy systems, engineering knowledge in order to speculate about energy system futures. And so it's the same with the social sciences. And final point, I agree with Jim that the near-term trends, bringing them in better in the SSPs is an important topic. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Thanks a lot to all the panelists. And then I would like to, for the final word, to hand over to Elizabeth again. And but already at this point, I want to thank Elizabeth and Ariel for putting this very, in my view, interesting session together. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. And you know what I'd like to say to everyone here is welcome. You know, this, when we were putting together this workshop, it felt initially like we were getting this set of proposals that were going to all be called social science. And what we've seen here is that social science can contribute in so many ways. And so I think it's important that we say again, welcome. Now, I'm going to say something a little provocative in my own comments. So one concern that in fact comes from many social scientists, this is a very kind of working group 2 perspective, perhaps explaining why some of the scenarios didn't even come into working group 2 in the same way that they were used in working group 1 and working group 3, was that a part of the social science community can find these scenarios to be quite reductionist. This is a critique that we also need to take on board. This is part of developing these scenarios. We need these scenarios. I'm also going to turn around and say that they ground so much of our assessment. They ground so much of the space that we need to be exploring. But they also need to be scenarios where people can see themselves. Decision makers can see themselves, and people can also see themselves. We need scenarios that, yes, elaborate the crises, that elaborate how armed conflict can undermine all the things that we care about. But we also need scenarios, and I think that this really speaks to the diversity of what social science can help inform, are scenarios that also honor the types of goals that we all share. And so, you know, I really do think we need to have our own conference where we elaborate this and we bring the modelers to get shared terminology, shared ideas about what the range of plausible socio-political pathways can be, and ones that really bring on board all the different aspects that social science can lend, everything from our deep understandings that can inform empirical models to questions that really inform what this future world will need to look like if we are going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the beginning of a discussion. We will be trying to put out a workshop summary for everyone. We hope that you engage again when we put out the summary, and we do hope that this can lead to more focused scholarship, both reminding us of the critiques, but also helping guide us to how we can put this into a framework that has been so critical for the decisions that will need to be made. So I'd like to thank you all again. Thank you.
¿Qué tal, mi Carmen? Bien, todo. Ya solo me queda una sesión en plenario por la tarde. Ya,